Forest mysteries. Elias found the deer at the edge of his land, where the spruce gave way to his hay field. The snow around it was trampled, but not by boots. He knelt, pressing his palm to the frozen ground. Wolf tracks. Big ones. They had dragged the carcass here, then left it without taking a single bite. He stood slowly, his knees popping in the cold. The deer was a young buck, its throat torn out clean. A message, not a warning, a gift, maybe, or a test. He looked toward the tree line. Nothing moved. Only the gray light of late afternoon and the silence that pressed against his ears like water. Elias was 72, though he looked older when he walked and younger when he worked. His hands were split at the knuckles, the skin cracked from decades of cold. He had lived on this homestead since before the road washed out, before the nearest neighbor became a 30-minute snowmobile ride. He hunted wolves once, trapped them, shot them, skinned them for the bounty the county paid until they stopped paying. He was good at it. The walls of his cabin still held the pelts of 6, their glass eyes dull in the firelight. But that was before. He dragged the deer to the barn. The weight told him he was weaker than last winter, though he would not say it aloud. He hung the carcass on the hook and wiped his hands on his coat. The tracks circled the barn twice. They knew where he slept. That night he sat by the wood stove, the rifle across his knees. Not because he expected them to come. He was trying to remember something. The scar on his right hand, a white seam across the thumb, itched the way it did before snow. He touched it, and the memory came without asking. She was limping. That was the first thing he saw. A she-wolf caught in a leg trap someone had left and forgotten. He had found her in a ravine, her hind leg torn, her eyes watching him with something he could not name. Not fear, not pleading, something older. He had raised his rifle. That was what a man did. Wolves killed calves, scared off deer, made the woods unsafe. But she did not snarl. She lay still, her sides heaving, and she watched. He lowered the gun. For 3 weeks, he brought her meat, changed the dressing on her leg, talked to her in the low voice he used for sick calves. When she healed, she left without looking back. He never told a soul. A hunter does not make a pet of a wolf, but maybe a man can make a pact. Now, 30 years later, the scar still pulled tight in the cold. He banked the fire and checked the door. The wind had picked up, rattling the window frame he had meant to fix last summer. Outside, the moon was rising over the hill behind his house, the one the old maps called Wolf Hill. He had never known why. Now he thought he did. He slept in his clothes, the rifle within reach. The howl came before dawn. Not close, but close enough. He sat up, his heart thumping once, hard, before settling into its usual rhythm. A second howl answered, then a third. A chorus. 7, maybe 8 voices. He counted as he pulled on his boots. The window faced east. The first light showed him the tree line and the shadows. 7. He had counted right. They stood at the edge of the pines, barely moving, their breath fogging in the still air. He watched them for a long minute. Then one stepped forward, larger than the others, gray with a dark streak down its back. It sat on its haunches and looked at the cabin. Elias did not move. His hand rested on the windowsill. The rifle was on the table behind him, but he did not reach for it. The wolf watched. He watched back. He thought of the she-wolf, the amber eyes, the way she had risen from the ravine and walked into the trees without a limp. This one had the same stillness, the same weight in its gaze. "You're hers," he said to the glass. The wolf stood, turned, and led the pack into the trees. They vanished like smoke. Elias stood at the window until the sun cleared the hill. Then he went to the stove and put the kettle on. His hands were steady. His mind was not. He had not seen wolves near the homestead in 20 years. Not since the old pack was hunted down, the one he himself had tracked for 3 winters. He had killed the alpha male on this very hill, shot him from 40 yards, watched him fall and not get up. Now they were back. He poured his tea and sat at the table, the rifle still untouched. The scar on his thumb throbbed. He looked at the pelts on the wall, 6 gray shapes frozen in death, and for the first time, they looked like strangers. He thought about the buck in the barn, the tracks that circled twice, the wolf that sat and watched. A hunter would have taken the rifle and tracked them. That was what a man did. That was what he had always done, but he was not sure he was a hunter anymore. He finished his tea and went out to chop wood. The cold air smelled of pine and iron. The tracks from last night were already filling with fresh snow. He worked until his arms ached, stacking the wood by the door, not looking at the hill. When he stopped to wipe his face, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. One wolf, the large gray, stood at the edge of the clearing where the forest met his field. It watched him for a moment, then laid down in the snow, as if waiting. Elias picked up the axe. He thought of the rifle inside. He thought of the she-wolf's eyes. He left the axe in the woodpile and went into the cabin. When he came back out, he carried a haunch of venison from the buck. He walked 50 yards from the house and set it on the snow. Then he walked back, not running, not looking behind him. From the window, he watched. It took 10 minutes. The wolf rose, approached the meat, sniffed it. It looked at the cabin once, then picked up the haunch and carried it into the trees. That night, there were no howls. The silence was deeper than before, but it did not feel empty. Elias sat by the stove, his hands wrapped around a mug, and wondered what he had just started. The cold deepened over the next week, settling into the bones of the land like something that meant to stay. Elias moved through his chores with the rhythm of a man who had performed the same motions for 50 winters, but something had shifted. He felt it each time he stepped outside, a weight at the edge of his awareness, a pressure against his back that made him turn toward the tree line more often than he meant to. He chopped wood until his shoulders burned, stacking it in cords against the cabin wall. The stove ate through oak and birch faster than it should have, or maybe he just noticed it more now. He repaired the barn door where the wind had worked the boards loose, hammering nails into frozen wood that fought him with every strike. The sheep watched him from their stall, their breath fogging the air, their bodies pressed together for warmth. He counted them twice each morning now. They were all there, all alive. The tracks appeared again on the third morning. Fresh prints circling the hay shed, cutting wide around the chicken coop, stopping at the edge of the garden where the snow lay deepest. He followed them to the tree line, his breath steady, his rifle left inside. The tracks did not cross onto his land with threat. They traced its borders like a man checking fence lines. He stood at the edge of the pines and looked into the gray tangle of branches. Nothing moved, but he knew they were there. He could feel them the way he used to feel deer before a hunt, that electric stillness that meant something living was watching. The memory of his son came to him unbidden as he walked back to the house. Mark had stood in this same yard 15 years ago, his city boots sinking into the mud, his face tight with the frustration Elias knew too well. "You'll die out here alone," Mark had said, not cruel, just tired. "This isn't living, Dad. It's just waiting." Elias had not answered then. He had watched his son drive away and told himself it was better that way. Now, standing in the snow with wolf tracks behind him and the empty cabin ahead, he wondered if Mark had been right. He pushed the thought down. Waiting was not the same as living. Maybe, but it was something. It was his. The deer population had shifted. He noticed it on the fourth morning when he walked the eastern ridge, the one that overlooked the frozen creek bed where he had set his trap lines years ago. The snow showed signs of a chase. A doe had run hard through the pines, her tracks deep and desperate, but there was no kill at the end. The wolves had driven her, but they had not taken her. He found their tracks 100 yards further, cutting north toward the ridge, away from his land. They were hunting the edges, keeping the deer away from his pasture, from his sheep, from the thin feed he had stored for the long months ahead. He did not know if that was intentional. He told himself it was not. Wolves did not manage territory for the benefit of old men. They followed hunger, instinct, the simple arithmetic of survival. But he remembered the she-wolf. He remembered how she had waited at the edge of his clearing after she healed, how she had stood for a long moment before walking away, how she had looked back once with those amber eyes that held something he still could not name. On the fifth day, he left another offering. A haunch from the buck, frozen solid, carried to the same spot 50 yards from his door. The next morning it was gone, and the track showed they had come and gone without approaching the cabin. He told himself he was being foolish. A hunter did not feed wolves. A hunter did not make a pact with predators. The men he had trapped with, the old ones who were all dead now, would have called him soft, would have laughed, and told him the wolves would tear his sheep apart before spring. They might have been right. But he kept leaving the meat. His leg ached in the evenings, the old wound from a falling tree 30 years back, the one that should have killed him and did not. He rubbed it with liniment that smelled of camphor and wintergreen and watched the fire burn down to coals. The pelts on the wall seemed to watch with him, 6 gray ghosts, their glass eyes catching the light. He had killed the alpha on Wolf Hill in the winter of '92. The shot had been clean, the animal dropping mid-stride, its blood steaming in the snow. He had skinned it there, his hands steady, his heart quiet. He had been proud of that pelt. It hung now above the door, the largest of the 6, its fur still thick and gray. He looked at it and felt nothing. Not pride, not regret. Just a hollow space where something used to be. On the 6th night, he woke before dawn and went to the window. The moon was down, the sky clear and black with stars. He saw them at the tree line, 7 shadows against the snow, their breath rising in silver plumes. They were sitting, all of them, facing the cabin. The large gray was in front, its head raised, its ears forward. He stood at the glass and watched them for a long time. They did not move. They did not howl. They simply waited, as if they were keeping watch over his sleep. He thought of the Evenki men he had met once, years ago, at a trapping camp north of the river. They had told him about wolves, about the old understanding, about the debts that passed between men and the wild. He had listened politely and dismissed it as superstition. Now he stood in the dark and wondered if they had known something he was only beginning to learn. The wolves rose together as the first light touched the hill. They turned and vanished into the pines. Elias let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He went to the stove and put the kettle on. His hands were steady, but his mind turned in circles. They were not a threat. He knew that now. They were something else, something he did not have a word for. A presence, a weight, a memory made flesh. He poured his tea and sat at the table. The pelt above the door stared down at him. He looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles, the white seam across his thumb. He had killed wolves for most of his life. He had saved one wolf once. Now 7 sat at his tree line and watched him sleep. He did not know what that made him. A fool, maybe, or something he had never been before. When he went out to chop wood that morning, the large gray was standing at the edge of the clearing. It watched him for a moment, then turned and walked into the trees. Elias stood with the axe in his hands and watched it go. He did not leave meat that day. He did not need to. The offering was not about food anymore. It was about something he was still trying to understand, something that moved beneath his thoughts like water under ice. That night, he did not take the rifle from its place by the door. He left it there, leaning against the wall, and he slept without it for the first time in 50 years. The thaw came without warning on the 10th day. Elias woke to the sound of water dripping from the roof, a sound so foreign to deep winter that he lay in bed for a full minute before understanding what he heard. The wind had shifted from the north to the west, bringing warmer air across the taiga, and the temperature had climbed to near freezing. By midday, the snow on the roof had begun to slide in wet sheets, and the path to the barn had turned to slush that clung to his boots with each step. He knew the warm spell would not last. These winter thaws came and went, fooling a man into thinking spring was closer than it was, and they always ended the same way, a hard freeze that turned everything to glass. He had lived through 50 of them and knew the signs. What he did not account for was how the warmth would pull him out of the cabin, how the sudden light and the sound of moving water would make him restless, would push him to do what he had been putting off for 3 weeks. The trapline needed checking. He had not run it since before the wolves came, telling himself the fur prices were too low to make the effort worth his time. But the pelts he had taken in the fall were still stacked in the barn, and the trader from the village would come when the roads opened in spring. One more run would add to the bundle, and the money, small as it would buy the supplies he needed before the next winter. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he was not looking for an excuse to walk the ridges, to see if the wolves had moved on, to prove to himself that he could still do what he had always done. But as he pulled on his snowshoes and checked the line of his rifle, he felt the old purpose settle into his chest like a hand closing. The rifle was the same one he had carried for 40 years, a bolt-action with a stock worn smooth by his grip. He loaded it out of habit, the cartridges clicking into place with a sound that had once meant safety. Now it felt like a lie. He almost left it behind. Almost. But the woods were the woods, and a man did not walk into them unarmed in winter. That was not wisdom. That was survival. He took the long route out, skirting the field where the wolf tracks had been, cutting through the pines toward the creek bed where his traps were set. The snow was heavy now, the warmth making it cling to his snowshoes in clumps that he had to knock loose every 100 yards. His breath came harder than it should have, and his leg ached with each step, the old wound protesting the unseasonable weather. The creek was where he had set the first line of traps, 3 of them, placed in the narrows where the ice forced the animals to cross. He found the first trap empty, the bait gone, the pan frozen shut. The second was the same. He reset them both, his fingers stiff inside his mittens, working with the patience of a man who had done this work since he was old enough to hold a trap. The third trap was gone. The chain had been pulled taut, the stake ripped from the frozen ground. He followed the drag marks for 50 yards before he found where an animal had chewed through the leather swivel and escaped. Wolverine, he guessed, from the width of the marks. He gathered what was left of the trap, the steel bent, the chain twisted beyond repair, and shoved it into his pack. The light was already fading when he reached the river. He had meant to turn back, to save the second line for another day, but the thaw had opened the ice at the edges, and he could see open water in the channel, black and moving. He wanted to see how bad it was. He wanted to know if the ice would hold for the winter still ahead. The old habit of reading the land pulled him forward when good sense told him to turn around. The river ice looked solid in the middle, gray and thick, but the edges were soft. He tested his weight with one foot, then the other, moving slowly, his pole in his hand like a dowser's rod. The ice groaned under him, a low sound that vibrated up through his legs, but that was normal. River ice always talked. He took another step, then another. He was halfway across when he saw the crack. It ran from the far bank toward the center, a dark line that had not been there yesterday. He stopped and leaned on his pole, watching it, waiting to see if it would widen. The ice was still. The water moved beneath it, black and patient, and he could feel the cold rising through the soles of his boots. He should have turned back. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had spent his life reading the land and had learned to trust what it told him. But turning back would mean admitting he had made a mistake, admitting that he was not the man he had been, that the caution he had always called wisdom was now just fear wearing a different name. He took another step. The crack was 10 feet ahead of him when the ice gave way. There was no warning, no sound, just a sudden falling that his mind could not process. He was standing on solid ice, and then he was not. The water closed over his waist, his chest, his shoulders, and the cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs in a single, ragged gasp. He grabbed for the edge of the ice shelf, his fingers scrabbling against the slick surface. His rifle was gone, dropped or knocked away, he did not know. The current pulled at his legs, trying to drag him under the ice, and he fought it, kicking, clawing, his mind blank with shock. He got one arm onto the ice, then the other, and he pulled. The ice held. He pulled again, dragging his chest out of the water, his legs still in the current, and then his hip hit the ice shelf, and something inside him broke. The pain came after the sound. He heard the snap first, a wet, crackling sound that he felt more than heard, and then the world went white. His leg buckled beneath him, the bones grinding against each other in a way that made his stomach heave. He tried to scream, but the sound that came out was thin and small, nothing like a man's voice. He pulled again, using only his arms now, his leg dragging behind him like something that did not belong to him. The ice was slick with water and blood. He did not know whose, and the cold was no longer a shock but a deep, spreading numbness that started in his feet and moved upward. He got his whole body onto the ice and lay there, face down, his cheek pressed to the frozen river, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The sky was gray above him. The light was fading. He was 5 miles from home, and he could not move his leg. He could not move anything except his arms, and they were shaking so hard he could not make them stop. He tried to sit up. The pain made his vision narrow to a tunnel, and he fell back against the ice, his teeth chattering, his body shaking with cold that was already turning to numbness. He looked at his leg. It was bent at an angle that was wrong, the thigh swollen inside his wet trousers, the foot turned outward like a thing forgotten. He was not going to make it home. He knew that with the same certainty he had felt when the ice gave way. The cold would take him first, or the blood loss, or the shock. He lay on the ice and waited for the darkness to come, and for the first time in his life, he did not know what to do. The pain faded into something dull and distant. The cold was warm now, or felt like warmth, and he knew that was the worst sign. He thought of the cabin, of the stove, of the tea he would never drink again. He thought of Mark, of the words he should have said and did not. And then he thought of the wolves, of the she-wolf's amber eyes, of the large gray that sat at his tree line and watched. He turned his head. The far bank was 50 yards away, a wall of pine and shadow. Something moved at the edge of the trees. A shape, gray against the snow. Another shape beside it. He blinked, and the shapes were closer, moving across the ice with a purpose that had nothing to do with hunting. He tried to raise his hand. He tried to shout. The sound that came out was nothing, a whisper lost in the wind. But they had heard it. The large gray was 10 feet away now, its eyes fixed on his face, and Elias looked into those eyes and saw something he had seen only once before, 30 years ago, in a ravine where a dying wolf had watched him and waited. He stopped fighting. The darkness closed in, and the last thing he saw was the wolf stepping forward, its breath warm against his frozen cheek, and then there was nothing. The cold pulled him back from the darkness. He did not want to come back. The darkness had been warm and quiet, a place without pain, and the cold was a hand gripping his chest, shaking him awake. He opened his eyes to a world of gray and white, and the pain returned all at once, a bright, searing thing that started in his leg and spread through his whole body until he could not tell where the pain ended and he began. His leg was wrong. He knew that without looking. The bones had shifted again when he tried to move, and the grinding sensation made his stomach clench. He lay still, breathing through his mouth, waiting for the wave to pass. The ice was hard against his back, and his clothes were frozen stiff. The water in the fabric turned to a crust that held no warmth at all. His mittens were gone. His hands lay on the ice like things that belonged to someone else, white and stiff, the fingers curled. He tried to remember how long he had been here. The sky had been gray when he fell, the light fading toward dusk. Now it was darker, the clouds thicker, The trees on the far bank reduced to black shapes against the snow. Hours, maybe. He did not know. Time had become something he could not hold on to, slipping away whenever he closed his eyes. He was not going to survive. The thought came to him with a clarity that surprised him, a clean line drawn through the fog of pain and cold. He had known men who froze to death, had found them in the spring sometimes, curled in the snow like sleeping children. They always looked peaceful. He wondered if he would look peaceful too when they found him. If they found him, his son would have to come. Someone would call him, tell him his father was gone, and Mark would fly up from the city and stand in the cabin and look at the walls and think about the words he had said 15 years ago. Elias did not want that. He did not want Mark to carry that weight, to wonder if he could have done something, to live with the memory of his father dying alone on a river 5 miles from home. But wanting did not matter now. The cold was doing its work, and he could feel himself slipping again, the edges of the world going soft and distant. He forced his eyes open. If he closed them again, he might not open them again. He knew that too. The wolves were there. He had not imagined them. 3 of them stood on the ice 20 yards away, watching him with eyes that caught the last light. Their breath rose in white plumes, and their bodies were low to the ice, their ears forward, their tails still. They did not move toward him. They did not move away. They waited. He tried to raise his head. The effort made the world spin, and he let it fall back against the ice. The largest wolf took a step forward, then stopped. Its nose worked the air, testing the wind, and Elias watched it and wondered what it smelled. Blood, maybe. Fear. The cold sweat of a dying man. He had hunted wolves for most of his life. He had killed their parents, their packmates, their young. He had trapped them and shot them and skinned them and hung their pelts on his wall like trophies. And now they stood on the ice and watched him die, and he could not blame them. He had earned this. Every man met what he deserved in the end, and maybe this was his. The large wolf took another step. Closer now. 10 yards. Elias tried to move his hand toward the rifle that was not there, lost in the river, and the motion made the wolf stop. Their eyes met. The wolves were amber, the same amber he had seen in the ravine 30 years ago, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had been closed for a very long time. He was not afraid. That was the strange thing. He lay on the ice with a broken leg and the cold stealing into his bones, and he was not afraid. He was tired. He was sorry, but he was not afraid. The wolf took another step, and then another, until it stood beside him, its body blocking the wind. He could smell it now, the wild musk of its fur, the faint scent of blood on its breath. It lowered its head and sniffed his face, its nose cold against his cheek, and he did not move. He did not have the strength to move. The wolf lay down. He felt the warmth of its body against his side, a line of heat that cut through the numbness. Another wolf came, and another, and they lay down around him, pressing against his back, his legs, his shoulders, and he could not understand what was happening, could not fit it into the world as he knew it. Wolves did not do this. Wolves did not lie down with dying men and share their warmth. Wolves were killers, not saviors. He had spent his life proving that. But they were here. They were warm, and he was still alive. He closed his eyes, and this time the darkness did not take him. He floated in a place between sleeping and waking, aware of the warmth around him, the rhythm of the wolves breathing, the weight of their bodies against his. The large wolf lay beside his chest, its head on its paws, and every few minutes it would lift its head and look at the trees, then settle again, keeping watch. He thought of the she-wolf again. He saw her limping out of the ravine, saw himself kneeling in the snow with his rifle on the ground beside him, saw the way she had looked at him before she walked away. He had never understood that look. He had told himself it was nothing, that she was just a wounded animal, that there was no meaning in her eyes. But he had kept the scar. He had kept the memory. And now her children lay beside him on the ice and kept him from freezing. He tried to speak. His lips were stiff, his tongue thick, but he forced the words out anyway, a whisper that the wind took before it could reach the wolf's ears. "She told you." The wolf did not move, but Elias felt its body shift against his, felt the warmth spread through his chest, and he knew that the words had been heard by something that understood them better than he did. The night passed in pieces. He would wake for a few minutes, aware of the dark sky, the wolves around him, the pain in his leg that had faded to a dull throb. Then he would sleep again, and in his sleep he dreamed of spring, of the ravine where he had found the she-wolf, of the way the light fell through the pines and touched her fur. He dreamed of Mark as a boy, learning to set traps, laughing at something Elias could not remember. He dreamed of his wife, dead 20 years, and when he woke from that dream his face was wet, and he did not know if it was tears or melting snow. The wolves stayed. They shifted positions sometimes, one rising to stretch, another taking its place, always keeping the circle closed, always keeping him warm. The large wolf never left his side. It watched the sky lighten from black to gray, watched the clouds thin and the first pale sun touch the snow, and Elias watched it watch and felt something he had never felt before in his life. Gratitude, not for rescue, not for salvation. Gratitude for not dying alone, for having something warm beside him in the last hours, for being seen by creatures that had every reason to let him freeze. It was not a feeling he knew how to hold. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and foreign, and he let it stay. He heard the voices at dawn. They came from downstream, faint at first, then louder, and he tried to shout, but his voice was gone, nothing left but a rasp that the wind carried away. The wolves heard them too. They raised their heads, their ears turning toward the sound, and for a moment Elias thought they would run. But they did not. They stayed beside him, their bodies pressed against his, and he realized they were waiting. They had done what they came to do, and now they were waiting to see if it was enough. The voices were closer now. He could hear the crunch of snowshoes, the sound of men calling to each other. The large wolf stood. It looked down at Elias for a long moment, and then it touched his face with its nose, a gesture so gentle that he felt his throat close. Then it turned and walked toward the trees, the pack following, and by the time the men appeared on the far bank, the wolves were gone, nothing left but tracks in the snow and the warmth still lingering in Elias's chest. The ceiling was white and low, and it took Elias a long time to understand that he was looking at it from a bed. The sheets beneath his hands were thin and rough, the kind that came from a hospital supply catalog, and the air smelled of antiseptic and boiled potatoes. He lay still for a long time, letting his eyes adjust to the light, letting his mind piece together the fragments of memory that floated up through the fog of pain and exhaustion. His leg was immobilized. He could feel the weight of a cast, the tightness of bandages wrapped from ankle to hip, and when he tried to move, the pain reminded him why he should not. His hands were bandaged too, the fingers wrapped in gauze that had been changed recently, the tips showing where the frostbite had taken the skin. He looked at them and thought about the wolves, about the warmth of their bodies, about the large gray that had pressed against his chest and kept his heart beating through the longest night of his life. A nurse came in with a tray and found him awake. She was young, her face round and plain, and she looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone who had been told to expect difficult patients. She checked his pulse, his temperature, the dressing on his leg, and she did not meet his eyes when she asked how he was feeling. "Where am I?" His voice was a rasp, the words scraping out of a throat that felt like it had been packed with sand. "Village clinic. You were brought in 2 days ago." She adjusted the blanket over his chest and stepped back. "You had surgery on your leg. The doctor will come to talk to you about it." He closed his eyes and tried to remember. The river, the ice breaking, the long night on the ice with the wolves pressed against him. And then voices, men calling, hands grabbing him, the jolt of being pulled across the ice on a sled. He remembered someone saying his name, someone else saying he was frozen solid, that there was no way he was alive. He remembered a woman's voice cutting through the noise, telling them to move faster, telling them he was breathing, that she could see his chest moving. Lydia. It was Lydia who had found him. He knew that now. His nearest neighbor, a widow who had lived on the next homestead for 20 years, who brought him eggs in the summer and never stayed to talk. She had seen him not come back, had seen the storm coming, had gathered the men from the village and gone out looking. The door opened again, and she came in. She was not young, not old either, with gray hair pulled back and hands that looked like they had done work all their lives. She carried a canvas bag that she set on the chair beside his bed, and she looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "You look like hell," she said. He almost laughed. The sound that came out was thin, more cough than laugh, but it was something. "Feel like it too." She sat down in the chair and folded her hands in her lap. She did not ask him what happened. She did not need to. The men who had found him had seen the tracks, had seen the circle of wolf prints in the snow around where he lay, had seen the way the wolves had retreated to the tree line and watched until he was loaded onto the sled. They had told everyone in the village before Elias even reached the clinic. "They're saying wolves saved you," she said. Her voice was flat, not disbelieving, just stating a fact. He looked at his bandaged hands. "They lay down beside me, kept me warm." The men saw the tracks, dozens of them, circling where you were. She paused. "They said the wolves were still there when they came, waiting at the edge of the trees." He remembered that. The large gray standing on the ice, watching the men approach, then turning and walking into the pines without looking back. He remembered the warmth still in his chest when they lifted him onto the sled, the strange sense that something had been finished, something he had started 30 years ago when he knelt in a ravine and chose not to pull the trigger. "It was her," he said. His voice was barely a whisper now. "The she-wolf I saved. Years ago. They were her children." She told them. Lydia did not say anything for a long time. She sat in the chair with her hands in her lap, and she looked at him with eyes that had seen enough of the world to know that some things did not fit into the stories people told themselves to make the world feel safe. She was a woman who had buried a husband and raised 2 children alone on a homestead that had tried to kill her more times than she could count, and she had learned to accept what came without asking it to make sense. "The doctor says you'll walk again," she said finally. "Not the way you did, but you'll walk." He nodded. The motion made his head swim, and he closed his eyes until it passed. When he opened them again, she was still there, and he was grateful for that. Grateful that someone was sitting beside him, that he was not alone in this white room with its antiseptic smell and its low ceiling. The village men came to see him in the days that followed. They came in the afternoons, after the morning chores were done, and they stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him like he was something they had not seen before. Some of them were hunters, men who had trapped wolves in the same woods where Elias had trapped them, and they did not know what to make of a story that turned everything they believed on its head. Old man Archibald came on the 3rd day. He was past 80 now, his back bent, his hands shaking, but his eyes were sharp, and when he looked at Elias, he looked at him the way he might look at a map that showed country he thought he knew. "The Evenki would say you have a debt," Archibald said. He did not ask about the wolves. He did not need to. "They would say the debt is paid now. You saved one. They saved you. The books are balanced." Elias lay in his bed and looked at the ceiling. "Is that what you think?" Archibald shrugged. "I think you are alive. I think the wolves did not kill you when they could have. I think you have been given something, and I do not know what it is." He turned to go, then stopped at the door. "When you get out of this bed, do not go back to hunting them. That is all I will say." He left, and Elias lay alone with the silence and the memory of the large gray's eyes, the weight of its body against his chest, the warmth that had seeped into him like water into frozen ground. He thought about the pelts on his wall, the 6 gray ghosts that had watched him for years, and he knew that when he went home, he would take them down. He did not know what he would do with them. Burn them, maybe, or bury them. something that felt like closing a door that should have been closed a long time ago. The nights were the hardest. When the lights were dimmed and the clinic settled into the quiet that came after the last rounds, he lay awake and listened to the sounds of the buildings settling around him. He thought about the river, about the moment the ice gave way, about the pain that had made the world go white. He thought about the wolves, about the way they had come to him on the ice, about the warmth of their bodies and the rhythm of their breathing. He thought about the she-wolf, about the day he had let her go, about the look in her eyes that he had never been able to forget. He had spent his life hunting wolves because that was what men did. Wolves killed livestock. Wolves killed deer. Wolves were a threat that needed to be managed, a problem that needed to be solved. He had never questioned it, not once. Not until the day he found the she-wolf in the ravine and something in him had shifted, had cracked open, had shown him a world where the lines between hunter and hunted were not as clear as he had been taught. Now that world was the only one he could see. Lydia came every day. She brought him books from the lending library in the village, westerns and crime novels that he read without really seeing them, and she sat with him while he ate the thin soup and bread that the kitchen served for dinner. She did not talk much, and he was grateful for that. She was a woman who understood silence, who knew that some things did not need to be said to be understood. On the fifth day, a man came from the county. He was young, with a clean jacket and a notebook, and he wanted to ask about the wolves. There had been complaints, he said. Some of the hunters were worried about the pack that had moved into the area. They wanted permission to track them, to thin them out before they became a problem. Elias looked at the man for a long time. He thought about the large gray, about the amber eyes, about the nose that had touched his face with a gentleness he had never expected from any living thing. He thought about the she-wolf, about the pact he had made without knowing it, about the debt that Archibald said was now balanced. "No," he said. His voice was stronger now, the rasp fading. "You leave them alone." The man looked at his notebook, at the cast on Elias's leg, at the bandages on his hands. "Sir, if there's a public safety concern." "They saved my life." He said it flatly, without drama, without the emotion that sat heavy in his chest. "They are not a threat. You tell the hunters they stay away from Wolf Hill. If there's a problem, it's mine to handle." The man left, and Elias lay back against the pillows and closed his eyes. He did not know if the hunters would listen. He did not know if he had the authority to make them listen. But he had said it, and that was something. That was a line drawn, a position taken, a choice made. He was not a hunter anymore. He did not know what he was. A man with a broken leg and frostbitten fingers, lying in a clinic bed, waiting to go home. A man who had been saved by wolves and did not know how to tell that story without sounding like he had lost his mind. A man who had spent a lifetime closing his heart to the wild and had finally, on a frozen river, been forced to open it. He thought about the pelt above his door, the alpha male he had killed on Wolf Hill, and he felt the weight of that death in a way he never had before. He had been proud of that kill. He had skinned the wolf and stretched the hide and hung it where everyone could see it, and he had thought that was what it meant to be a man in the taiga. To take what you wanted, to prove you were stronger, to make the wild bend to your will. He had been wrong. He knew that now. The wild did not bend. It waited. It watched. And sometimes, if you were lucky, if you had done something right without knowing it, it gave you something you could never have taken for yourself. He opened his eyes and looked at Lydia, who was sitting in the chair beside his bed, reading a book she had brought for herself. She looked up when she felt his gaze, and she raised her eyebrows in a question he could not answer. "I'm going home," he said. "Soon." She nodded. "I'll make sure the place is ready." He wanted to thank her. He wanted to thank the nurse, the doctor, the men who had come out on the ice to find him. He wanted to thank the wolves, the large gray, the she-wolf who had died somewhere in the woods with the memory of a man who had been kind to her once. But the words were too big, too heavy, and he did not have the strength to lift them. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the ice broke, he slept without dreaming of the cold. The truck bounced along the frozen track that led to his homestead, and Elias felt every rut and stone in his leg. The cast was heavy, a white shell from hip to ankle, and he had wedged himself against the door to keep from sliding across the seat. Lydia drove with the careful concentration of a woman who had learned to handle bad roads before she learned to drive, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the ruts that passed for a road. She had come to the clinic that morning with clean clothes and a quiet determination that had not asked whether he was ready to go home, had simply assumed that he was. The homestead came into view through the trees, and Elias felt something tighten in his chest. The cabin looked smaller than he remembered, the roof sagging a little where he had never gotten around to replacing the rafters, the woodpile half the size it should have been for this late in winter. The barn stood with its door half open, the way he had left it when he went out to check the trapline. He had been gone nearly 2 weeks, and the place looked like something that had been waiting for him to come back and either save it or let it go. Lydia parked as close to the door as she could get and cut the engine. She looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the trees beyond, and she did not say anything about the wolf tracks that crossed the yard and circled the woodpile. She did not need to. They both saw them. "I'll get the stove going," she said, and she was out of the truck before he could answer, her boots crunching on the frozen snow, her breath rising in white clouds. He sat in the truck for a long moment, his hands on his thighs, his eyes on the cabin. He had built this place with his own hands 40 years ago, had raised a family here, had buried his wife from here, had watched his son drive away from here. He had thought of it as his place, his land, his life. Now he looked at it and felt like a stranger, not because it had changed, because he had. The crutches were awkward, and the snow made them worse. He managed the distance from the truck to the door in a series of lurches, his good leg taking most of his weight, the cast swinging out to the side like something that did not belong to him. Lydia had the door open before he reached it, and she took his arm without asking, steadying him as he crossed the threshold. The cabin was cold. The stove had not been lit in 2 weeks, and the air smelled of dust and cold ash and something else, something that might have been the memory of smoke. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the walls, and what he saw made his breath catch. The pelts were still there. 6 of them, gray and still, their glass eyes catching the pale light from the window. The alpha male hung above the door, its mouth frozen in a snarl that had once made him proud and now made him feel something he could not name. He had killed that wolf on Wolf Hill in '92, had tracked it for 3 days through snow that came up to his knees, had shot it at 40 yards and watched it fall. He had skinned it himself, stretched the hide, hung it where everyone could see. He had been proud of that. He was not proud now. Lydia was at the stove, feeding kindling into the firebox, her movements quick and practiced. She did not look at the pelts. She did not need to. She had been in this cabin before, had sat at this table, had drunk tea from these cups. She knew what hung on the walls. She did not judge him for it, but she did not praise him for it either. He made it to the chair by the stove and sank into it, his legs stretched out in front of him, the crutches clattering to the floor. He was breathing hard, the effort of moving across his own yard leaving him winded and weak. He looked at his hands, the bandages replaced with clean gauze that Lydia had brought from the clinic, the fingers still stiff, the tips still black where the frostbite had taken the skin. He would lose the tips of 2 fingers, the doctor had said. Not enough to matter, but enough to remind him. The fire caught, and the warmth began to spread through the cabin. Lydia put the kettle on and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup that she had poured for herself while he watched. She did not ask him how he felt. She did not ask him what he was going to do now. She sat with him in the silence and let him find his own way into the space that had been his for 40 years and now felt like someone else's. "The sheep are at my place," she said after a while. "I moved them when you didn't come back. They're fine." He nodded. He had not thought about the sheep. He had not thought about anything except the river and the cold and the warmth of the wolves against his chest. "I'll bring them back when you're ready," she said. "Or I can keep them. Doesn't matter to me." He looked at her. She was not young, not old either, with lines at her eyes that came from squinting into the sun and hands that had done work all her life. She was a practical woman, the kind who did not waste words on things that did not need saying, and she had been his neighbor for 20 years without ever becoming a friend. He was not sure what she was now. Something different. Something that happened when a woman pulled a man off the ice and sat beside his bed in the clinic and drove him home when he could not drive himself. "Thank you," he said. The words came out rough, scraped clean of the pride that had always stopped him from saying them before. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded once, and that was enough. The days that followed were hard in ways he had not expected. The cabin that had been his refuge was now a prison, the walls closing in on him with each day that passed. He could not chop wood. He could not feed the sheep, even if they had been there. He could not walk to the tree line, could not see the hill where the wolves had sat and watched him, could not know if they were still there or if they had moved on now that their debt was paid. Lydia came every morning to light the stove and bring him food. She did not stay long, but she stayed long enough, and he found himself looking forward to her visits in a way that made him uncomfortable. He had been alone for so long. The pelts were still there. 6 of them, gray and still, their glass eyes catching the pale light from the window. The alpha male hung above the door, its mouth frozen in a snarl that had once made him proud and now made him feel something he could not name. He had killed that wolf on Wolf Hill in '92, had tracked it for 3 days through snow that came up to his knees, had shot it at 40 yards and watched it fall. He had skinned it himself, stretched the hide, hung it where everyone could see. He had been proud of that. He was not proud now. Lydia was at the stove, feeding kindling into the firebox, her movements quick and practiced. She did not look at the pelts. She did not need to. She had been in this cabin before, had sat at this table, had drunk tea from these cups. She knew what hung on the walls. She did not judge him for it, but she did not praise him for it either. He made it to the chair by the stove and sank into it, his legs stretched out in front of him, the crutches clattering to the floor. He was breathing hard, the effort of moving across thinking is not doing. Archibald drank his tea and set the cup down on the table. The Evenki say that when you kill a wolf, you carry it with you. The weight of it stays on your back until you let it go. You have been carrying 6 wolves for a long time, Elias. It is time to put them down. He left after that, and Elias sat in the chair and looked at the pelts until the light faded. The weight of them. That was what he felt when he looked at them now. Not pride, not memory. Wait. 6 dead wolves that he had killed and skinned and hung on his walls, and he had never once thought about what they had been before he shot them. They had been animals, threats, problems to be solved. He had never thought of them as anything else. He had not thought about the she-wolf that way. That was the difference. When he had found her in the ravine, something had stopped him from pulling the trigger. Something had made him kneel in the snow and look into her eyes and see something that was not a threat, not a problem, not a thing to be solved. He had saved her because he could not kill her, and he had never understood why until now. Now he understood. She had looked at him, and he had seen himself. The next morning, he waited until Lydia left, and then he got on the crutches and made his way across the room. The alpha male was high on the wall, nailed in place with the same spikes he had driven 40 years ago. He took the poker from the stove and used it to pry the nails loose, one by one, working until his arms shook and sweat ran down his face. The pelt came down with a rush of dust, and he let it fall to the floor. He stood over it, breathing hard, and looked at the gray fur, the glass eyes, the mouth frozen in a snarl that was not a snarl anymore, just a shape that someone had sewn into place. He picked it up. It was lighter than he remembered, the hide stiff with age, the fur dull. He carried it to the door and threw it out into the snow. The other 5 came down that day. He worked until his arms gave out, until his leg throbbed with a pain that made him see spots, until the last nail was pulled and the last pelt lay in the snow beside the others. He stood in the doorway and looked at them, 6 gray shapes against the white, and he felt something lift from his chest that had been there for so long he had forgotten it was there at all. Lydia came the next morning and saw the pelts in the snow. She did not ask why. She helped him carry them to the barn, where he laid them in the empty stall where the sheep used to be. He did not know what he would do with them. Burn them, maybe, or bury them. Something that felt like an ending. That night, he sat by the stove and looked at the bare walls. The nails were still there, 16 of them, scattered across the floor where he had left them. He would pull them out tomorrow, patch the holes, paint the walls, make the cabin into something new. He thought about the wolves. He wondered if they were still out there, if they watched his cabin at night, if they had moved on to other territory now that the debt was paid. He wanted to see them. That surprised him. He wanted to walk to the tree line, wanted to stand at the edge of the pines and see if the large gray would come, wanted to look into its amber eyes and thank it for something he did not have words for. But he could not walk. Not yet. So he sat by the stove and waited, and he let the silence of the cabin settle around him. And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt like peace. A week passed. The snow began to melt in the afternoons and freeze again at night, the days growing longer, the light returning to the sky. He learned to move on the crutches, learned to cook for himself, learned to live in a house that did not have dead wolves on the walls. Lydia came less often now, and he did not mind. He was learning to be alone again, and this time the loneliness did not feel like a weight. It felt like space, like room for something new. On the 8th night, he woke before dawn and went to the window. The moon was down, the sky clear and black with stars. He saw them at the tree line, 7 shadows against the snow, sitting in a line, their breath rising in silver plumes. The large gray was in front, its head raised, its ears forward. He stood at the glass and watched them. They watched him back. They did not move. They did not howl. They simply waited, the way they had waited on the ice, the way they had waited at the edge of his clearing for weeks before he fell. They were still there. They had not moved on. He raised his hand, not in greeting, not in farewell, just in acknowledgement. The large gray tilted its head, and for a moment, Elias could have sworn it understood. Then the wolf stood, turned, and led the pack into the trees. They vanished like smoke, and Elias stood at the window until the sun cleared the hill, and he knew that whatever had started on the ice was not finished. It was only beginning. The truck came up the road on a Thursday afternoon, the sound of its engine carrying through the trees long before Elias saw it. He was sitting on the porch, the crutches beside him, the sun warm on his face for the first time in months. The snow had begun to recede from the south-facing slopes, and the air had the wet, heavy smell of mud and running water that meant spring was not far off. He had been watching the tree line, waiting for a glimpse of the wolves that he had not seen in 3 days, and the sound of the truck pulled his attention away from the forest and toward the road. He recognized the vehicle before he recognized the man driving it. It was a rental, a clean truck with no rust on the fenders, the kind of thing that city people drove when they came up to see the leaves change in the fall. It moved slowly along the rutted track, the driver picking his way around the worst of the holes, and when it pulled into the yard and stopped, Elias felt something shift in his chest that he had not expected. Mark stepped out of the truck. He was 45 now, his hair thinning, his face softer than it had been the last time Elias saw him. He wore city clothes, a dark jacket and boots that were too clean for the mud he was about to walk through, and he stood beside the truck for a long moment, looking at the cabin, looking at his father, looking at the crutches and the cast, and the hands that still wore bandages on the fingers. Elias did not say anything. He had not known Mark was coming. Lydia must have called him, or someone from the village, or maybe Mark had seen something on the news, some small story about an old man who fell through the ice and was saved by wolves. There had been a reporter, a young man who had come to the clinic and been turned away, and Elias had hoped that was the end of it. But nothing ended that way anymore. Not with the internet. Not with phones that took pictures and sent them across the world in seconds. Mark walked toward the porch. His boots made sucking sounds in the mud, and he stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at his father with an expression that Elias could not read. It was not anger. It was not relief. It was something more complicated, something that had been building for 15 years and had finally found its way to the surface. "You didn't call," Mark said. His voice was careful, the way people's voices were careful when they were trying not to say what they really thought. "Didn't think it was worth calling about." Elias looked at his son and saw the boy he had been, the one who had learned to set traps and gut fish and walk in snowshoes before he was 10, the one who had left all of it behind for a life that made sense in a way that this life never had. "You drove a long way." "I flew. The rental was at the airport." Mark climbed the steps and stood on the porch, his hands in his pockets, his eyes moving from his father's leg to his hands to the cabin door that stood open behind him. "I saw the news. Someone put a video up. From the clinic. People were saying you died out there." "I didn't die." "I can see that." Mark's voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, toward the barn, toward the trees, toward anything that was not his father's face. "You should have called." Elias felt the weight of that. He had thought about calling, once or twice, in the long nights at the clinic when he could not sleep. He had thought about picking up the phone and hearing his son's voice and telling him what had happened. But he had not known what to say. He had not known how to tell a story that he barely believed himself. And he had not known how to ask for something he had spent his whole life pretending he did not need. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make tea." The cabin was different than Mark remembered. That was the first thing Elias noticed, watching his son look around the room. The pelts were gone, and the bare walls showed the pale rectangles where they had hung for decades. The nails were still in place, 16 of them, and the holes they left were like ghosts of the animals that had hung there. Mark stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the empty spaces, and Elias saw him try to fit what he was seeing into the story he had carried in his head for all these years. "Where are they?" Mark asked. He did not need to say what he meant. "Took them down. They're in the barn." Elias moved to the stove, the crutches clunking against the floorboards, and put the kettle on. He did not look at his son while he worked. He did not want to see the judgment that might be there, or worse, the confusion. Mark sat in the chair by the window, the one that looked out toward the hill. He was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Softer. "I heard about the wolves. The men who found you said they were there, lying beside you." "They were." "And you think they're the same ones? The ones from before?" Elias turned from the stove and looked at his son. He saw the skepticism there, the city-bred disbelief that came from a life lived in a world where things made sense in a certain way. But he saw something else too. Something that looked like hope, like his son was asking him not for proof, but for permission to believe. "They're hers," Elias said. "The one I saved. Her children, maybe her grandchildren. I don't know how they knew, but they knew." Mark looked at the window, at the hill beyond, at the empty walls and the stove, and the father who was not the man he remembered. "That's not how wolves work, Dad. That's not how anything works." "Maybe not." Elias poured the tea and carried it to the table, his balance uncertain on the crutches, his hands shaking with the effort. "But it's what happened." They sat in silence for a long time, drinking tea that neither of them tasted. The afternoon light slanted through the window, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the floor like bars. Elias watched his son and thought about all the things he had never said, all the words that had sat between them for 15 years, growing heavier with each season. "I thought you would be dead," Mark said finally. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "When I saw the video, when I saw them pulling you off the ice, I thought you were dead. And I was standing in my apartment in the city, looking at my phone, and I realized that if you died, I wouldn't have. I never." He stopped, and his hands tightened around the cup. I never came back. Not once. You had your life. That's not an answer. Mark looked at him, and his eyes were wet in a way that Elias had not seen since he was a boy. You could have died out there, and I wouldn't have been here. I wouldn't have known until someone called me and told me to come identify the body. Elias set his cup down. The words sat between them, and he did not know how to answer them. He had told himself for 15 years that Mark's leaving was a choice, that his son had chosen the city over the land, the future over the past. He had told himself that it was better this way, that a man who stayed in the taiga did not need a son who left it. But sitting here now, with his leg in a cast and his hands bandaged, and his son looking at him like a man who had been given something he thought he had lost, he knew that he had been wrong. I'm still here, he said. It was not enough. He knew it was not enough. But it was true. Mark nodded slowly. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked out the window again. How long until you can walk without those? He pointed at the crutches. Another month. Maybe 2. Then you'll need help. It was not a question. Elias looked at his son, at the city clothes and the clean boots, and he thought about the work that needed to be done before spring. The roof needed patching. The barn door needed hanging. The woodpile needed to be split and stacked for next winter. There was a month of work there, maybe more, and he could not do any of it. I don't need help, he said, and even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Mark looked at him with something that might have been a smile, the first one Elias had seen since he stepped out of the truck. You always said that, even when you did. They sat in the silence that followed, and it was not the same silence that had filled this cabin for 15 years. It was something else, something that had room in it for words that had not been said, for things that had not been done. Elias looked at his son and felt something open in his chest that he had closed a long time ago. He did not know what to call it. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe just the simple, hard thing of letting someone in after you had spent a lifetime keeping them out. That night, Mark slept in the room that had been his when he was a boy. Elias lay in his bed and listened to the house settle around him. And he thought about the wolves on the hill, about the she-wolf in the ravine, about the large gray that had pressed against him on the ice and kept him alive. He thought about his son, asleep in the next room, come back after 15 years because a pack of wolves had saved an old man's life. He did not know what it meant. He did not know if it meant anything at all. But as he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like the story was not over, like there was more to be written, more to be lived, more to be said between a father and a son who had finally, after all these years, found their way back to each other. The wolves did not come that night, but Elias did not need them to. For the first time in a long time, he was not alone. The first week was the hardest. Mark woke before dawn on his second morning, not because he wanted to, but because the cold had worked its way through the walls and into his bones in a way that no apartment in the city had ever prepared him for. He lay in the narrow bed that had been his when he was a boy, listening to his father move around the kitchen, the clunk of the crutches on the floorboards, the hiss of the kettle on the stove. The sounds were familiar in a way that made his chest ache, and he lay in the dark for a long time before he got up. He found Elias at the table, a cup of tea in front of him, the morning paper spread out where Lydia had left it the day before. The cast on his father's leg was still white and clean, but the bandages on his hands had been changed, and Mark could see the dark tips of the fingers where the frostbite had taken the skin. He looked at those fingers and thought about the ice, about the river, about the wolves that had lain beside his father and kept him alive, and he did not know what to say. There's wood to be split, Elias said without looking up. Out by the barn. The axe is where it always was. Mark stood in the doorway and looked at his father. He had not split wood in 20 years, not since he left this place for college, for a job, for a life that did not require him to know which end of an axe to hold. He had told himself that leaving was the right choice, that the taiga was a place that took more than it gave, that his father's life was a slow death dressed up in the language of independence. Now he stood in the cold kitchen with his hands in his pockets and wondered if he had been wrong about everything. "You think I remember how?" he asked. Elias looked up then, and there was something in his eyes that Mark had not seen before. Not judgment, not disappointment, something closer to patience. "You remember." The axe was where it always was, leaning against the barn wall beside the splitting stump that had been there since Mark was old enough to hold the handle. The woodpile was low, the logs that Elias had cut before the accident stacked in uneven cords against the wall, and Mark picked up the axe and tested its weight. It was heavier than he remembered, or maybe he was lighter, softer, a man who had spent 20 years sitting at a desk and calling it work. The first log took him 3 swings to split. The axe bit into the wood at the wrong angle, and the blade stuck, and he had to wrestle it free while his breath came in clouds and his hands grew cold inside the gloves that were not thick enough for this work. By the 10th log, he had found the rhythm again, the swing and the follow-through, the way the wood would crack and fall away from the blade. His shoulders burned. His palms were raw, but the logs were splitting. Elias watched from the porch, the crutches beside his chair, a mug of tea cradled in his bandaged hands. He did not say anything, and that was worse than if he had. Mark worked through the morning, splitting and stacking, building the pile back up to something that might last through the end of winter. When he stopped for water, his shirt was wet with sweat under his jacket, and his arms shook with a fatigue that he had not felt since he was a boy learning this work for the first time. "Not bad," Elias said when Mark came up to the porch, "for a man who's been sitting in an office for 20 years. Mark laughed. It was a surprise sound, something that came out of him before he could stop it. "I'm going to feel that tomorrow." "You're going to feel it tonight." Elias nodded toward the cabin. "There's liniment in the cupboard. The green bottle. Rub it into your shoulders before you sleep." They ate dinner in silence, the way they had when Mark was a boy, the way that had once felt like distance and now felt like something else. The stew was from a can, heated on the stove, and they ate it with bread that Lydia had brought the day before. Mark looked around the cabin and noticed again the bare walls, the pale rectangles where the pelts had hung, the absence of something that had been there his whole childhood. "Why did you take them down?" he asked. Elias set his spoon down and looked at the wall above the door. "Didn't need them anymore." "You hunted wolves your whole life. You were proud of that." "I was." Elias picked up his spoon again, but he did not eat. "And then I found one that I couldn't kill, and I spent 30 years trying to forget that. When the ice broke, when I was lying there on the river, I thought about her, about the wolf I let go, and I understood something I should have understood a long time ago." Mark waited. The silence stretched between them, and he did not fill it. "I was wrong," Elias said, "about the wolves, about what I was doing. All those years, I thought I was protecting what was mine, but it was never mine. The land, the animals, none of it. I was just passing through, and I spent my whole life killing things that were passing through too." Mark looked at his father's hands, the bandaged fingers, the scar across the thumb that he had never asked about. He thought about the stories he had heard, the ones that had come down from the village, from the men who had found his father on the ice. Wolves lying beside him, keeping him warm, waiting until help came. Wolves that should have let him freeze, that had every reason to let him freeze, but did not. "You think they remembered," Mark said. "The one you saved. You think she told them." Elias was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, and Mark had to lean forward to hear him. "I don't know what I think. I know what happened. I know she looked at me in a way that no animal had ever looked at me before. I know that when I was dying, her children came and lay down beside me. I know that if they hadn't, I would be dead. That's what I know." Mark sat back in his chair and looked at the window, at the dark beyond, at the trees that he had walked through as a boy and had not thought about in years. He had told himself that leaving was the only choice, that the taiga was a place that consumed the people who stayed, that his father's life was a slow erasure of everything that mattered. But sitting here now, in the cabin that his father had built, eating stew from a can and listening to the wind in the trees, he wondered if he had been the one who was erased. If the city had worn away something that he had not known he needed until he came back. The next morning, he woke before dawn and went out to split wood. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the cold was the kind that hurt to breathe. He worked until the sun came up, until his arms gave out and his hands bled through the gloves. And when he came back to the cabin, Elias was at the stove, making tea. "There's a fence line that needs mending," Elias said. "West pasture, where the creek bends. The deer have been pushing through it." Mark looked at his father. "You want me to fix the fence? I want you to walk the land. See what's changed. See what hasn't." The walk took him 3 hours. The snow was patchy now, the ground showing through in brown and gray, and the creek was running fast with meltwater. He followed the fence line, mending where the wire had snapped, tightening where the posts had leaned, and he watched the land open up around him in ways he had forgotten. The ridge where he had tracked deer with his father, the hollow where the beavers had dammed the stream, the meadow where he had seen his first moose, standing in the tall grass like something out of a dream. He found the tracks at the edge of the west pasture. Wolf tracks, fresh from the night before, circling the fence line and turning back toward the trees. He knelt and touched the print, the edges sharp in the mud, and he thought about the wolves that had saved his father, that had lain beside him on the ice and kept him breathing. He had not believed it when he heard it. He was not sure he believed it now, but the tracks were there, and they led toward the hill, and something in him wanted to follow them. He did not. He finished the fence and walked back to the cabin, and when he got there, Elias was on the porch, watching the hill. "They came last night," Elias said, "while you were sleeping. I heard them howling around midnight." Mark sat on the porch steps and looked at his father. "Did you see them?" "No, but I heard them. 7 voices. The same as before." Elias looked at his son, and for a moment, Mark saw something in his eyes that he had never seen there. Not weakness, not fear, something closer to wonder. "They're still here. They didn't leave after the ice. They stayed." Mark looked at the hill, at the trees, at the place where the tracks had led. "Why?" "I don't know." Elias picked up his crutches and stood, his weight balanced on his good leg, his face tight with the effort. "Maybe they're waiting for something. Maybe they're just watching. Maybe they're not done with me yet." The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Mark woke before dawn, split wood, mended what was broken, learned to move through the land the way he had when he was a boy. He found himself remembering things he had not known he remembered. The way the wind shifted before snow, the calls of the birds that meant spring was coming, the paths through the woods that his father had shown him, and that he had walked so many times that his feet knew them without his mind having to think. He did not see the wolves, but he saw their tracks every morning, circling the cabin, tracing the edges of the property, never coming too close. They were watching, waiting. He did not know what for. One night, after dinner, Elias sat by the stove and looked at his son with an expression that Mark had learned to recognize over the past weeks. It was the look that meant something was coming, something that had been sitting in his father's chest for a long time, waiting for the right moment to be said. "You were right," Elias said. "When you left, you said I was waiting to die out here. You were right." Mark started to speak, but Elias held up his hand. "Let me finish. I was waiting. I didn't know it, but I was. I had done everything I was going to do, killed everything I was going to kill, built everything I was going to build. And then I found that wolf, the one I couldn't kill, and something changed. I didn't know it then, but it changed. And when she came back, when her children came and saved me, I understood." He looked at the window, at the dark beyond, at the hill where the wolves waited. "I wasn't waiting to die," he said. "I was waiting to understand. And it took a pack of wolves to make me see what I should have seen a long time ago." Mark sat in the silence and let the words settle. He looked at his father, at the cast on his leg, the bandages on his hands, the scar on his thumb that he now knew came from a wolf that had looked at a man and seen something worth saving. And he understood, for the first time, that he had been wrong too. Not about leaving. That had been his choice, and it was not wrong. But about what he had left behind. "I'll stay," he said, "until you can walk, until you're back on your feet." Elias looked at him, and then Mark looked at the window, at the hill, at the tracks that would be there in the morning, circling the cabin, keeping watch. "And then we'll see." That night, Mark lay in his bed and listened to the wind. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the window, beyond the trees, a wolf howled. One voice, clear and long, rising into the night. He lay still and listened, and when the howl faded, he heard another voice answer from the ridge. And then another, and another. 7 voices, the same as before. He closed his eyes and slept, and in his dreams, he walked through the taiga with his father, tracking wolves through the snow, and he was not afraid. He was home. The storm came without warning on the last day of March. Mark had walked the fence line that morning, the sky clear and cold, the sun sharp on the snow that still clung to the north slopes. By midday, the wind had shifted to the north, and by afternoon, the sky was the color of old iron, the clouds moving in low and fast. Elias felt it in his bones before he saw it. The pressure change that had told his body about storms for 70 years, and he told Mark to bring in wood. They stacked it by the stove, enough for 3 days, and by the time the first snow came, the cabin was sealed and the fire was high. The wind hit at dusk. It came out of the north with a sound like a train in the distance, growing louder until the whole cabin shook with it. The snow was not the soft, wet snow of late winter. It was small and hard, driven by the wind until it sounded like sand against the glass. Mark stood at the window and watched the world disappear, the trees fading to ghosts, the barn vanishing, the hill where the wolves watched swallowed by white. "It's a bad one," Elias said. He was sitting by the stove, his cast stretched out, his hands wrapped around a mug. He did not look worried. He looked like a man who had seen this before, many times, and knew what it required. "We'll be here 2 days, maybe 3. Mark turned from the window. His face was pale, his hands tight at his sides. He had grown up in this country, but 20 years in the city had softened something in him, replaced the old knowledge with a fear that he did not know how to name. "The roof held last winter?" "The roof is fine. The stove is hot. We have food and water." Elias watched his son with eyes that saw more than Mark wanted him to see. "Sit down. You're making the cabin cold with all that worry." Mark sat. He tried to relax, but every groan of the wind made him tense. Every rattle of the window frame sent a pulse of fear through his chest. He had forgotten what it was like, a real storm, the kind that could bury a house and kill a man 50 feet from his door. He had forgotten, and now he remembered, and the remembering was worse than the storm. Elias talked that night. He talked more than Mark had heard him talk in years, maybe more than he had ever talked. He told Mark about the winter of '87, when the snow came in November and did not stop until April. He told him about the trapline he ran alone that year, about the wolverine that followed him for 3 days, about the night he spent in a snow cave when the temperature dropped to 40 below. He told him about Mark's mother, about the winter they met, about the spring they built the cabin together, board by board, with nothing but hand tools and the will to stay. Mark listened. He did not interrupt. He watched his father's face in the firelight, the lines that the cold had carved there, the hands that had held him when he was small, the eyes that had watched him drive away and had not called him back. He listened to the stories and he understood, for the first time, that his father had been waiting not to die but to tell them. To tell someone. To tell him. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, the wind was so loud that they could not hear each other speak without shouting. Mark sat by the window and watched the snow pile against the glass. higher and higher, until the light turned blue and then gray and then almost dark. He thought about the wolves. He wondered where they were, if they had found shelter, if they were curled against each other somewhere, waiting. On the third day, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that Mark woke from a doze with the sense that something had broken. He went to the window. The snow had drifted to the sill, but beyond it the sky was clear, the sun low and pale, and the world was new, remade, unrecognizable. He dug them out. It took him 4 hours, a shovel he found in the barn, a path he cut through drifts that were taller than he was. Elias watched from the porch, the crutches under his arms, his breath steaming in the cold. When Mark finally broke through to the yard, he stood in the open and looked at the sky and felt something he had not felt in 20 years, the simple, hard joy of having survived. He saw the deer at the edge of the clearing. It was lying in the snow, half covered, its throat torn out. The tracks around it were fresh, the snow still loose in the prints. Wolves. He looked at the tree line, expecting to see them, but there was nothing there. Only the deer, left where they would find it, a gift or a message or both. He went back to the cabin and told Elias what he had found. Elias did not look surprised. He looked at the hill, at the trees, at the place where the tracks led, and he nodded slowly. "A parting gift," he said. Mark stood beside him and looked at the deer, at the tracks, at the forest that had given them something when they had nothing left to give. "They're leaving." "I think so." Elias's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "They did what they came to do. Now they'll go. Maybe they'll come back. Maybe they won't. But for now, this is goodbye." That night, Mark built the fire high and cooked the venison that had been in the freezer since before the accident. They ate in silence, and the silence was not empty. It was full of everything they had said and everything they had not needed to say. When Mark looked at his father, he saw a man who was not waiting anymore. A man who had been given something, who had paid a debt he did not know he owed, who was ready to live whatever years were left to him without the weight of the past on his back. After dinner, Elias went to the window and looked out at the hill. The moon was rising, full and white, and the snow glowed with a light that seemed to come from within. He stood there for a long time, and Mark stood beside him, and they watched together. They did not see the wolves, but Mark knew they were there, somewhere in the dark, watching the cabin, watching the hill, watching the two men who stood at the window and waited for a sign. He thought about the she-wolf his father had saved, the one with the amber eyes, the one who had told her children about a man who was kind when he did not have to be. He thought about the debt that had been paid, the balance that had been struck, the thing that had passed between them that was older than words. "Will you come back?" Elias asked. His voice was low, and he did not look at his son when he spoke. "After you leave, will you come back?" Mark looked at his father's profile, the gray beard, the scar on his thumb, the eyes that were still watching the hill. He thought about the city, about his apartment, about the life he had built there. He thought about the cabin, the cold, the work that never ended. He thought about the wolves, the deer they had left, the way the light fell through the pines in the morning. "Yes," he said, and he meant it. Elias nodded. He did not smile, but something in his face eased, something that had been tight for 15 years. "Good." They stood at the window until the moon cleared the hill, and then Mark helped his father back to his chair, and they sat by the stove, and the cabin was warm, and the wind was quiet, and for the first time in a very long time, both of them were home. Spring came late that year, but it came hard. The snow went in the first week of April, turning the yard to mud and sending the creeks over their banks. Mark stayed longer than he had planned. Through the cast coming off and the first tentative walks without crutches, through the roof repair and the barn door and the 100 small tasks that had waited through the winter. He stayed until Elias could walk to the woodpile and back without stopping, until the sheep were back from Lydia's and the first green showed on the south slopes. He left on a Tuesday morning. Elias stood on the porch and watched him pack the rental truck, watched him hesitate at the door, watched him walk back for one last handshake that turned into something longer, something that did not need words. They stood in the mud with the sun on their faces, and Elias looked at his son and saw a man he had not known was there, buried under the years and the silence. "You'll come back," Elias said. It was not a question. Mark looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the hill where the wolves had watched through the winter. "I'll come back." He drove away, and Elias watched until the truck was out of sight, and then he went inside and sat by the stove and let the silence settle around him. It was not the same silence that had filled this cabin for 15 years. It was lighter, easier, the silence of a man who was alone by choice and not by necessity. The wolves did not come back that spring. Elias walked the ridges in May, when his leg was strong enough for the hills, and he found their tracks on Wolf Hill, old now, half covered by new growth. They had moved on, north maybe, or west into the deep woods where the hunting was better and there were no old men with broken legs to watch over. He stood on the hill and looked at the tracks and felt no sadness. They had done what they came to do. The debt was paid. The story was finished. But stories are never finished. He learned that in June, when a truck came up the road that he did not recognize. It was not Mark's rental. It was an old truck, rusted at the fenders, and the man who stepped out of it was young, maybe 30, with a face that Elias did not know. He stood in the yard and looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the old man on the porch, and he did not speak until Elias asked him what he wanted. "My grandfather told me about you," the young man said. "He said you knew something about wolves, something that wasn't in the books." Elias looked at him. "Who is your grandfather?" "Archibald. Old man Archibald. He died in the spring. Before he went, he told me to come find you. He said you had a story to tell." The name sat in Elias's chest like a stone. Archibald was gone. Another one of the old ones, the men who had known the taiga before the roads and the power lines, who had carried the old knowledge in their bones. He looked at the young man, at his hands, at the way he stood with his weight balanced, and he saw that Archibald's grandson was a hunter too, or wanted to be. He had the look of a man who was looking for something he had not found. "Come inside," Elias said. "I'll make tea." They sat at the table, and Elias told him. Not the whole story, not at first. He told him about the wolves that had come back to the hill, about the deer they had left at the edge of his land, about the long winter when he had watched them from his window and wondered what they wanted. He told him about the ice, about the leg, about the night on the river when he had been sure he was going to die. He told him about the warmth against his chest, the breath on his face, the eyes that had looked at him with something he still did not have a word for. The young man listened. He did not interrupt. He did not smile or nod or make the small sounds that people make when they want you to know they are listening. He sat with his hands around his cup and he listened, and when Elias was done, he looked at the old man and asked the question that had been waiting in the room between them. "Do you think they knew? The wolves. Do you think they remembered what you did for her?" Elias looked at the window, at the hill, at the green where the snow had been. He thought about the she-wolf, about the ravine, about the way she had looked at him before she walked away. He thought about the large gray on the ice, the warmth of its body, the gentleness of its nose against his frozen cheek. He thought about the tracks on the hill, fading now, blowing away, leaving nothing behind but the memory and the scar on his thumb. "I think she told them," he said. "I think she carried something with her, some understanding, some memory. And when her children came, they knew what to do. Not because I deserved it, because she had taught them." The young man left as the sun was setting. He stood in the yard and looked at the hill, and Elias saw something in his face that he recognized. Not belief, not yet, but something that was moving toward belief, the way water moves toward the river, slow and patient and unstoppable. "If you ever want to hunt wolves," the young man said, "I wouldn't do it here. Not on this land." Elias looked at the hill. "No, Not on this land. Mark came back in July. He brought his son, a boy of 8 named Samuel who had never seen the taiga except in pictures, who stood in the yard with his mouth open and his eyes wide, looking at the forest like it was something out of a story. Elias watched the boy from the porch, saw the wonder in his face, and felt something pass through him that he had not felt in a very long time. Hope, maybe, or something that looked like hope. The boy wanted to see everything. He walked the fence line with his grandfather, his legs working hard to keep up, his questions coming faster than Elias could answer them. He wanted to know about the deer, the birds, the tracks in the mud. He wanted to know about the wolves. Mark had told him something, a version of the story, but the boy wanted to hear it from the man who had been there. They sat on the porch in the evening, the 3 of them, and the sun went down behind the hill, and the light turned gold, and then red, and then the deep blue that came before dark. Samuel sat on the steps, his chin in his hands, and looked at the hill where the wolves had watched. "Are they still there?" he asked. "The wolves." Elias looked at the hill. He had not seen them since spring, had not found fresh tracks since the snow melted. He had told himself they were gone, that the story was over, that the debt was paid and the pack had moved on to other territory. But looking at the hill now, with his grandson beside him and his son behind him, he was not so sure. "Maybe," he said, "maybe they're still there. Maybe they're watching right now." Samuel looked at the hill, squinting into the fading light. "I don't see anything." "They don't want to be seen. Not unless they want to be." Elias looked at his hands, the scar on his thumb, the fingers that had healed crooked, the nails that would never grow back right. He thought about the she-wolf, the amber eyes, the debt that had taken 30 years to pay. But they're there. They'll always be there. Mark came out with the lamp and set it on the table between them. The light caught his face, older now, softer, the face of a man who had come back from somewhere and was not planning to leave again. "Dad," he said, Tell him the story." Elias looked at his grandson, at the wide eyes, the open face, the boy who had never seen a wolf but wanted to believe they were out there, watching, waiting. He thought about Archibald, dead now, and the young man who had come to hear the story. He thought about Lydia, who had pulled him off the ice and sat beside his bed and driven him home. He thought about the she-wolf, dying in the ravine, and the choice he had made that had changed everything, though he had not known it then. "A long time ago," he said, "an old hunter found a wolf. She was hurt, caught in a trap, and she should have been afraid. But she wasn't. She looked at him with eyes that knew something he didn't know. And he looked back, and he saw something that made him put his rifle down." Samuel leaned forward. The light from the lamp caught his face, and Elias saw his own features there, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw. He saw something else too, something that was not his, something that belonged to the boy, to the future, to the stories that would be told when he was gone. "What did he see?" the boy asked. Elias looked at the hill, at the dark line of trees against the sky, at the place where the wolves had sat and watched him for a winter and then saved his life. He thought about the she-wolf's eyes, the amber eyes that had followed him for 30 years, that had found him on the ice when he was dying, that had sent her children to lie beside him and keep him warm. He thought about the debt, the pact, the thing that passed between them that was older than words, older than men, older than the tiger itself. He saw himself, Elias said. He saw something that needed saving, and he did something that no hunter should do. He saved it. And that wolf, she remembered. She told her children, and her children told their children. And one winter, when that old man was dying on the ice, they came back. They lay down beside him. They kept him warm, and they waited until help came, because that was what she had taught them. Samuel looked at the hill. The light was almost gone now, the stars coming out one by one, the sky turning black above the trees. The boy was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was small in the dark. "Do you think they'll come back? The wolves?" Elias put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. The scar on his thumb was white in the lamplight, a seam that ran from knuckle to wrist, and he thought about the she-wolf's teeth, the gentleness of her mouth when he had dressed her wound, the way she had looked at him when she walked away. "I don't know," he said. Maybe someday. And if they do, you'll be here, and you'll know what to do." They sat on the porch in the dark, the three of them, and the night was warm, and the stars were bright, and somewhere in the forest beyond the hill, something moved in the shadows. Elias did not see it. He did not need to. He had seen enough. He had been given enough. He sat with his son and his grandson, and he let the silence settle around them, and he was not waiting anymore. He was living. The story did not end that night. It never ends. It passes from one hand to another, from one voice to another, from the old man on the porch to the boy at his feet, from the boy to whoever comes after. It is a story about a wolf and a hunter, about a debt that was paid and a bond that was never broken, about the thing that passes between us and the wild when we are brave enough to see ourselves in the eyes of something we were taught to fear. Elias sat on his porch and looked at the stars, and he was not a hunter anymore. He was not a survivor or a hermit or a man waiting to die. He was a storyteller, and the story he told was the only one that mattered. The one about the wolf that taught him that some debts are paid not with blood, but with warmth, with waiting, with the simple, impossible gift of not dying alone. The wolves did not come that night, but Elias knew they were out there, somewhere, in the dark beyond the hill, watching the light from the cabin, watching the man who had saved their mother, watching the boy who would carry the story forward. And he knew that they would always be there, in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, in the howls that came on winter nights, in the memory that passed from father to son, from generation to generation, as long as there was someone to tell it. He went inside when the lamp burned low. Mark was already in his room, Samuel asleep in the bed that had been his father's, and Elias moved through the cabin with the ease of a man who had lived in one place for a lifetime and planned to live there a little longer. He banked the stove, checked the door, stood at the window, and looked at the hill one last time. There was nothing there, only the dark and the trees and the stars. But he raised his hand anyway, a gesture that was not quite a wave, not quite a goodbye. Just a man, alone in his cabin, acknowledging something that he could not see and could not prove, but that he knew, with the certainty of a man who had been given a second life, was there. He went to bed. The cabin was quiet. The wind was still. And somewhere in the forest, on a hill that had been called Wolf Hill for as long as anyone could remember, 7 shadows moved through the pines, their breath silver in the moonlight, their eyes amber, their feet silent on the needle-carpeted ground. They did not howl. They did not need to. They had done what they came to do. They had paid the debt. And now, in the long summer night, they were watching, waiting, keeping the old pact alive for another season, another generation, another story. The story is not over. It never is.